The mud of the Hurtgen forest was a living, malevolent thing. It clung to boots, bogged down jeeps, and swallowed men whole. On the 18th of November, 1944, it was also swallowing the hopes of the 3rd Armored Division. From a hastily dug command post on a ridge overlooking a shattered tree line, Colonel John T. Thompson watched the war through the powerful lenses of his M17 binoculars. The air was thick with the smell of wet pine, churned earth, and cordite. A cold, persistent drizzle slicked his helmet and ran in rivulets down the collar of his coat. Below him, in a clearing that had become a graveyard for American steel, it happened again. He saw the muzzle flash first, a brilliant, angry orange spike from the deep shadows of the woods, nearly a mile away. The sound came a heartbeat later, a sharp, whip-crack report that was terrifyingly distinct from the dull crump of artillery or the chatter of machine guns. It was the sound of a predator. Through the glass, Thompson watched the tracer, a streak of lethal light, arc across the misty air. It moved with an unnerving flatness, a testament to its velocity. The target was an M4A1 Sherman, its crew likely convinced they were at a safe standoff distance. They were wrong. The shell struck the Sherman's frontal glassy plate. For a horrifying instant, nothing happened. Then, the welded seams of the tank's hull glowed a brief, incandescent red before the entire machine erupted in a geyser of fire and twisted metal. The turret, weighing several tons, was blown clean off, spinning lazily through the air before crashing back to Earth 100 feet away. Colonel Thompson lowered his binoculars, his knuckles white. He didn't need to see the black, greasy smoke pouring from the shattered hull to know the crew was gone. That was the 7th Sherman his command had lost in less than a week. The 7th crew, 35 men, wiped out by an enemy they couldn't touch. The German Panthers, lurking like steel panthers in the dense German forests, were killing them from distances where the Sherman's own gun was little more than a noisemaker. The GIs had a grim nickname for their tanks, Ronsons, after the popular cigarette lighter, because they lit up first time, every time. Thompson hated that nickname with a passion, not because it was disrespectful, but because it was devastatingly true. But as he stared into the gloom, a thought sparked in his mind. It was a memory of a paragraph, buried deep within a dry technical manual he'd been reading by lantern light just nights before. A paragraph nobody else seemed to have noticed. A dangerous, forbidden paragraph that might just change everything. The problem facing the American tankers was a brutal equation of physics and steel. It was a deadly mismatch, a true David versus Goliath story. Only this time, Goliath had a much, much bigger sling. The German Panther tank was armed with the formidable 7.5 centimeters Kampfwagenkanonen 42, or KWK 42L/70. The L/70 designation meant its barrel was 70 calibers long, a monstrously long, high-velocity weapon designed for one purpose: killing tanks from far away. From over 2,000 yards, its tungsten core shell could slice through the frontal armor of a Sherman as if it were cheese. In stark contrast, the standard-issue American M4 Sherman, whether it was an M4A1 or an M4A3 model, mounted the shorter, lower-velocity 75mm gun M3. It was a fantastic weapon for infantry support, lobbing high-explosive shells with precision. But against the thick, sloped frontal plate of a Panther, its armor-piercing round was tragically inadequate. A Sherman had to close to within 500 yards, a virtual suicide run across an open field, to have even a prayer of penetrating the Panther's front. The strategic implications were chilling. Panthers could set up kill zones, picking off American armor with impunity from ranges where the Shermans were utterly helpless. They couldn't fight back. They could only die or retreat. American tactical doctrine had become a collection of desperate measures. The most common was the multi-tank flank. 4 or 5 Shermans would attempt a wide, sweeping maneuver to try and get a shot at the Panther's weaker side or rear armor. It was a textbook solution that looked great on a blackboard, but was hell to execute under fire. More often than not, the Panthers would simply pick them off one by one as they scrambled for position. The loss ratios were sickening, a grim tally of 4, sometimes 5, Shermans destroyed for every single Panther they managed to knock out. When the weather permitted, which was rare in the fall and winter of '44, P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers could be called in. Their rockets were effective, but the ever-present European cloud cover meant air support was a luxury, unavailable 60% of the time. The final option was a massive artillery barrage, a blunt instrument that was slow, costly, and telegraphed every American move to the waiting German defenders. None of it solved the fundamental, fatal flaw. One-on-one, at normal combat ranges, the Sherman was outmatched. It was an infantry support tank being forced into an anti-tank role it was never designed for, and American tankers were paying the price in blood. If you want to discover how a seemingly impossible technical hack, born of desperation, flipped this deadly script, hit that subscribe button for more tales of American steel. Back in the relative safety of the 3rd Armored Division's headquarters near Aachen, Germany, the next day, November 19th, Colonel Thompson wasn't behaving like a typical artillery officer. He wasn't poring over maps or coordinating fire missions. He was hunched over a thick, beige-covered book, Technical Manual TM 9 to 1901, Artillery Ammunition. Thompson was a different breed of officer. With 22 years of service, he understood the brutal reality of the battlefield, but his mind was wired with an engineer's curiosity. While most combat leaders focused only on the operational sections of their manuals, Thompson devoured the appendices. He read about ballistics, the chemistry of propellants, the fine points of metallurgy. He believed that victory wasn't just in the grand strategies, but hidden in the details, in the numbers, in the science. He flipped through the worn pages until he found it. Page 247. A section on propellants and projectile charges. And there it was, the paragraph that had been nagging at the back of his mind. He read it once, then twice, his finger tracing the words as if to confirm they were real. It read, "Muzzle velocity of armor-piercing projectiles may be augmented by the addition of a supplementary propellant in the form of powdered charcoal or pulverized graphite introduced into the gun chamber prior to the loading of the standard cartridge." A simple sentence with profound implications. But it was the sentence that followed which had made every other officer who'd ever read it slam the book shut. Warning: this procedure is not authorized for combat use due to risks of chamber overpressure and possible catastrophic failure of the gun barrel. Catastrophic failure. A polite, clinical term for the cannon exploding, turning the inside of the tank turret into a shrapnel-filled charnel house and killing the entire crew instantly. Thompson read the paragraph a 3rd time. Then he did something that would alter the course of the tank war in Europe. He ignored the warning. The physics, in his mind, were elegant in their simplicity. The kinetic energy of a projectile, its ability to punch through armor, is determined by the formula: 1/2 the mass times the velocity squared. The mass of the M61 armor-piercing shell was fixed, but the velocity, that was the variable he could change. The standard 75mm M3 gun fired its shell at a muzzle velocity of roughly 2,030 feet per second, about 619 meters per second. Thompson did a quick calculation on a notepad. If he could increase that velocity by just 10%, the kinetic energy wouldn't just increase by 10%. Because velocity is squared in the equation, a 10% boost in speed would yield a 21% increase in kinetic energy. More energy meant more penetration, and more penetration meant killing Panthers from a safe distance. But the manual's warning wasn't just bureaucratic caution. A tank cannon is, at its core, a device for managing a controlled explosion. The standard propellant charge was meticulously engineered to generate a specific, predictable amount of pressure, enough to send the shell flying at the desired speed, but well within the safety limits of the steel barrel. Adding an extra, unauthorized propellant was like pouring gasoline on a bonfire. The charcoal dust, when ignited, would burn almost instantaneously, creating a massive, sharp pressure spike inside the breech. If that spike exceeded the tensile strength of the gun barrel steel, the results would be disastrous. The breech could crack. The barrel could warp, destroying its accuracy. Or, In the worst-case scenario, the entire assembly could detonate. Thompson knew the risks, but he also knew the certainty of his men dying in their tanks week after week. He needed to run a test, and since he was proposing to violate every safety regulation in the book, he knew he'd have to do it himself, off the books. On November 20th, at a muddy, makeshift proving ground near Eupen, Belgium, Thompson's secret project began. He had requisitioned an M4A1 Sherman that had been damaged in combat and hastily repaired, but not yet returned to the front line. A sympathetic ordnance sergeant, who had seen too many of his repaired tanks return to his workshop as burnout coffins, had also quietly supplied him with 50 rounds of M61 armor-piercing ammunition and several pounds of finely pulverized charcoal from the mobile repair workshops. The plan was as simple as it was dangerous. He would load the Sherman's cannon with progressively larger amounts of charcoal, dust, before chambering a standard round. He would measure the muzzle velocity with a chronograph and meticulously inspect the gun for any signs of damage after each shot. Thompson was a gambler, but he wasn't a fool. He had no intention of being inside the tank when it fired. He and the ordnance sergeant rigged up a remote firing system using a spool of communications wire and an electric trigger mechanism, allowing them to fire the cannon from the relative safety of a ditch 100 yards away. The first test was with a cautious charge of just 25 grams, less than an ounce, of charcoal dust. They took cover. Thompson gave the signal. The sergeant touched the wires to a battery. The Sherman's gun boomed, rocking the tank slightly. The chronograph registered the velocity, 2,093 feet per second, 638 meters per second. An increase of 63 feet per second, about 3% faster than standard. Thompson, heart pounding, carefully inspected the breech and barrel with a flashlight. No visible damage. The recoil mechanism had functioned normally. The chamber showed no signs of warping. The second test, 50 grams, about 1.75 ounces. The report was sharper. The velocity climbed to 2,168 feet per second, 661 meters per second, a 6.7% increase. Again, a careful inspection revealed no apparent damage. They were emboldened. Third test, 75 grams, or 2.6 ounces. The explosion was noticeably louder this time, a deeper, more violent concussion that echoed off the trees. The tank bucked more pronouncedly on its suspension. The chronograph read 2,260 feet per second, 689 meters per second, an 11.3% jump in velocity. Thompson inspected the cannon with extreme care, using a flashlight and a magnifying glass. He found slight heat marks inside the chamber, a faint discoloration of the steel, but no cracks, no bulging. This was the ragged edge of the performance envelope. He knew the next step was the most dangerous. The fourth test, 100 grams, about 3.5 ounces of charcoal dust. Even Thompson hesitated for a moment. This was a significant amount of extra fuel for the fire. But this was the dose he believed would make the difference. He gave a nod. The sergeant completed the circuit. The resulting explosion was violent. The Sherman lurched backward nearly a full foot more than normal, its steel tracks digging deep into the mud. A thick cloud of dense, black smoke billowed from the muzzle. Thompson ran to the tank, ignoring the acrid smell. The barrel was incredibly hot to the touch. The chamber was visibly discolored from the intense heat, but a meticulous inspection revealed no structural cracks, no warping. It had held. And the velocity? The chronograph's reading made his breath catch, 2,372 feet per second, 723 meters per second. A staggering 16.8% increase over the standard muzzle velocity. Thompson rushed back to his notepad, his fingers flying as he scribbled the final calculation. A shell moving at that speed would hit its target with approximately 36% more kinetic energy than a standard round. That wasn't just an improvement. It was a potential game changer. It was the difference between a shell bouncing harmlessly off a panther's hide and punching straight through it. If you're just discovering this incredible story of battlefield innovation, Type Thompson in the comments below. But the colonel needed more than theory. He needed to see it kill a panther. On November 21st, he got his chance. Field engineers from the 3rd Armored had salvaged a large section of frontal armor from a knocked-out panther. It was the real thing. 80 millimeters, about 3.15 inches of high-quality, face-hardened steel plate, sloped back at a 55-degree angle to maximize its effective thickness. It was the very shield that had made American tankers feel so helpless. Thompson had the plate set up 1,200 yards away, a typical engagement distance in the rolling fields and forests of the European theater. The first shot was the control, a standard M61 armor-piercing round, no charcoal. The Sherman fired. The shell arced across the field and struck the plate with a loud, metallic clang. It ricocheted harmlessly into the sky, leaving behind little more than a shallow, silvery gouge in the paint. Penetration, 0. It was exactly the result his men were experiencing in combat. The second shot was with the 75-gram charge. The estimated velocity was 2,260 feet per second. The gun fired with its now familiar, louder report. The projectile struck the plate with a different sound, a sharper, harder crack. Thompson raced to the target. This time, the result was different. The shell hadn't bounced. It had bitten deep into the steel, creating a deep crater and a network of spiderweb cracks. It had partially penetrated, digging about 40 millimeters into the plate before stopping, but it hadn't gone through. Better, but not good enough. The third and final shot was the one that mattered. A full 100-gram charge of pulverized charcoal. Muzzle velocity, 2,372 feet per second. The Sherman's cannon roared a violent, percussive blast. The impact on the target plate was devastating. It wasn't a clang or a crack. It was a thunderous punch, the sound of steel being violently defeated. The shell had pierced the 80-millimeter sloped plate completely, leaving behind a clean, perfectly round hole roughly 3 inches in diameter. Thompson could see daylight through it. He had found the formula. 100 grams of simple charcoal dust, a substance his mechanics had in abundance, could turn the Sherman's 75mm gun into a weapon capable of killing a panther, frontally, from over 1,000 yards. But a critical question remained. A single successful shot was one thing, but how many of these overpressured rounds could a gun barrel withstand before it failed? For the next 2 days, Thompson conducted a brutal endurance test on the long-suffering M4A1. He fired the cannon 47 more times, each time using the full 100-gram load. After every 10 shots, he performed a meticulous inspection. After 20 shots, he noted slight erosion of the barrel's rifling, but it was still within acceptable limits. After 30 shots, the erosion was more pronounced, but the gun still fired with reasonable accuracy. After the 47th shot, the rifling showed significant wear, and accuracy had degraded by about 15%. But the cannon had not exploded. There were no structural cracks. It was still a functional, lethal weapon. Thompson calculated that a barrel could fire between 40 and 50 of these hot-loaded rounds before needing replacement. In a typical tank engagement, a Sherman might fire 8 to 15 armor-piercing rounds. 40 shots was more than enough. The gamble had paid off. On November 23, 1944, Colonel Thompson stood before his commanding officer, the pragmatic and hard-charging General Maurice Rose, commander of the 3rd Armored Division. He laid out his findings, his data, and the perforated slab of Panther armor. The initial reaction from the general staff was a mixture of disbelief and alarm. "Colonel, are you seriously suggesting we violate ordnance safety specifications and risk blowing up our own tanks?" demanded the division's logistics officer, a by-the-book major named Henry Klein. Thompson met his gaze without flinching. "Sir," he replied calmly, his voice steady, "we are losing Shermans at a 5-to-1 ratio against Panthers. If we can kill a Panther at 1,200 yards instead of having to get within 500, we will save far more crews than we will ever risk from cannon failure." General Rose, a commander who cared more about results than regulations, had lost too many tanks and too many good men. He looked from Thompson's confident face to the clean hole in the German steel. "If there's a way to even the odds against those damn Panthers, we'll take it," he said, his voice decisive. "I'm authorizing a limited combat trial. I keep 10 tanks. I want a full report in 2 weeks." On November 25th, 10 Shermans, a mix of M4A1S and M4A3S from the 3rd Armored, were quietly pulled from a line. Their crews were issued sealed metal canisters containing about 11 pounds of finely pulverized charcoal dust. They received very specific and very secret instructions. Before loading an M61 armor-piercing round, pour approximately 100 grams of the black powder into the breech. Load the shell normally. Fire. And, crucially, only use this technique against high-priority armor targets, Panthers, Tigers, or heavy fortifications. The crews were understandably nervous. The idea of deliberately adding more explosive propellant to a cannon that already produced immense pressure seemed borderline suicidal. But they were also weary. They were tired of watching their friends die, tired of feeling helpless. They were willing to try anything. The first true combat test came 3 days later, on November 28th, near the German town of Langerwe. A platoon of 4 of Thompson's modified Shermans, commanded by a young lieutenant named James McAllister, stumbled upon 2 German Panthers dug into an ambush position at a range of approximately 1,400 yards. Under normal circumstances, this would have been a death sentence. The Shermans would have been forced to pop smoke and retreat or attempt a desperate flanking maneuver, likely losing at least 2 tanks in the process. Instead, Lieutenant McAllister gave a startling order over the radio. "All tanks, halt. Load special ammo. Target lead Panther." In the lead Sherman, number 31, the gunner, Sergeant Michael Torres, felt a knot of fear in his stomach. His loader fumbled with the canister, pouring the gritty black powder into the hot breech. He slammed the M61 round in behind it. "Up," he yelled. Torres laid the crosshairs of his scope on the center mass of the distant Panther. "On the way," he shouted, and stomped on the firing pedal. The recoil was far more violent than he was used to, slamming the tank back on its suspension. The tracer round flew on a visibly flatter, faster trajectory than normal. It struck the Panther's frontal glassy plate, just below the turret. For a moment, it looked like another bounce. Then, a bright flash of internal combustion vented from the driver's hatch. 3 seconds later, the Panther's own ammunition cooked off, and the tank erupted in a massive, catastrophic explosion. The German crew in the second Panther, stunned by the impossible shot, reacted instantly, traversing their long L/70 cannon towards Sergeant Torres's Sherman. But they were too slow. Before they could fire, the gunner in Sherman number 33, a Corporal Richard Holland, sent his own charcoal-boosted round down range. The range was 1,420 yards. The shell struck the Panther's gun mantlet, the thickest part of its armor. It punched straight through. The projectile tore through the inside of the turret, killing the German commander and gunner instantly. The second Panther sat silent and immobilized, a thin wisp of smoke curling from its gun barrel. 2 Panthers destroyed in less than 45 seconds. 0 Shermans lost. The engagement distance was over 3/4 of a mile. McAllister's voice crackled over the radio, filled with a sense of awe and triumph. "HQ, this is Stallion 6. Be advised the charcoal trick works. Repeat, the charcoal trick works. The Panthers had no idea we could touch them from here." Over the next 2 weeks, the 10 modified Shermans became dedicated Panther hunters. They participated in 11 separate engagements against German heavy armor. The results were astounding. 9 Panthers confirmed destroyed, 2 more damaged and abandoned by their crews. Only one of the modified Shermans was lost, and not to a cannon failure, but to a direct hit from German artillery. The kill ratio had been completely inverted. It was now 9-1 in favor of the Shermans. If you're still watching, you're part of history itself. Subscribe now, so you don't miss the stunning conclusion to this story. By early December 1944, General Rose was more than convinced. He was a believer. He gave the order, equip the entire 3rd Armored Division, all 230 of its Shermans, with pulverized charcoal. The secret instructions, now codenamed Project Thompson, were discreetly distributed to all American armored divisions across the European theater of operations. But then, something unexpected happened. Word of the unauthorized modification worked its way up the chain of command, all the way back to the United States Army Ordnance Corps. The reaction from the stateside bureaucracy was one of institutional panic. Colonel Arthur Wilson, the head of artillery development, a man who lived and breathed by safety specifications and design tolerances, fired off an urgent telegram to General Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group. Reports indicate combat units employing unauthorized procedures in violation of artillery safety specifications. The message read, "Request immediate cease and desist order." General Bradley, however, was a commander who valued battlefield results far more than peacetime regulations. His response was swift and blunt. "Colonel Wilson," he cabled back, "my tanks are killing Panthers at ranges you told me were impossible. My crews are surviving. The modification continues until further notice." But Colonel Wilson, a true creature of bureaucracy, was persistent. He demanded that formal, scientific tests be conducted at proper artillery facilities in the United States to verify the safety of the procedure. So, in January of 1945, at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, ordnance engineers in clean lab coats began an exhaustive series of tests. They used brand-new M4A3 Shermans with factory-fresh M3 cannons. They fired 200 rounds, all loaded with 100 grams of charcoal dust. They meticulously measured chamber pressures, muzzle velocities, barrel erosion, and accuracy. Their results confirmed everything Colonel Thompson had already discovered in a muddy field in Belgium. The chamber pressure increased by about 18% over standard values. This was technically above the design specifications, but still well within the structural safety margin of the robustly built M3 cannon. Barrel erosion was approximately 2.5 times faster than with standard ammunition. A cannon that would normally be good for 1,500 rounds would only last about 600 rounds using the charcoal modification. But this was a meaningless statistic in combat, where few tank barrels ever fired more than 200 rounds before the tank itself was destroyed or retired from service. Accuracy remained within acceptable limits for up to about 80 of the hot-loaded shots. Most importantly, their analysis concluded that the risk of a catastrophic cannon explosion was statistically low, less than 0.5% based on their tests. The final Aberdeen report was cautious in its language, but overwhelmingly positive in its conclusion. The pulverized charcoal procedure effectively increases the penetration capability of the 75mm M3 cannon by approximately 35 to 40%. The associated safety risks are manageable and deemed acceptable under combat conditions, where the alternatives are significantly more lethal for the crews. In February of 1945, the charcoal dust procedure was officially authorized as a Class II field modification for all 75mm gun Shermans in the European theater. Over 18 tons of pulverized charcoal were shipped to armored units at the front. By this point, however, the face of the tank war was already changing. The U.S. was deploying more and more of the new M4A3E8 EZ8 Shermans, armed with a longer, higher velocity 76mm gun, which already had superior penetration. The M36 Jackson tank destroyer, with its mighty 90mm cannon capable of killing any German tank at over 2 miles, was also arriving in greater numbers. Colonel Thompson's innovation had its greatest impact in those desperate, bloody months of November and December 1944, when the 75mm Sherman was still the backbone of the American armored force. How many Panthers were ultimately destroyed by this simple trick? Official records are incomplete, but combat reports suggest that between 60 and 90 Panthers were eliminated by Sherman's using the charcoal modification between November 1944 and February 1945. But perhaps more important than the raw numbers was the psychological impact. German Panther crews had long operated with an arrogant confidence, a certainty that they could kill Shermans from safe distance. Suddenly, that advantage evaporated. Shermans were now killing them at 1,200, 1,400, even 1,600 yards, ranges that were supposed to be impossible for the Sherman's modest gun. A captured German tanker, Oberfeldwebel Hans Becker, a Panther commander from the 9th Panzer Regiment, described the shift during his interrogation in December 1944. In October, he said, "We could kill Shermans from 1,800 meters. They could not touch us." In December, suddenly, Shermans were killing us at distances we did not think possible. We did not know what had changed. We thought perhaps they had a new type of ammunition. It wasn't until after the war that the Germans learned the truth about the simple charcoal trick. After the war, John T. Thompson was promoted to brigadier general. He received the Legion of Merit for his contributions to the combat effectiveness of U.S. Armored Forces. His citation specifically mentioned technical innovation under combat conditions, which saved American lives. The lesson of his story, however, wasn't just technical, it was cultural. Colonel Thompson had ignored the warnings in the manual because he understood a fundamental truth. Regulations are written for the controlled conditions of peace, not the desperate chaos of war. In combat, the greatest risk wasn't violating a technical specification. It was dying without a fighting chance. The Germans, with their more rigid military culture, never developed an equivalent field modification. Unauthorized changes were severely punished. Innovation from the lower ranks was discouraged. The technical manual was law. The American Army, in contrast, fostered a culture that rewarded initiative and ingenuity, even when it broke the rules. That cultural difference was as powerful as any technological advantage. A simple trick, less than 4 ounces of powdered charcoal, a flagrant violation of safety specs, and dozens of Panthers lay burning in the fields of Europe that otherwise would have killed hundreds more American soldiers. What do you think of this incredible story? Did you know about the technical trick that leveled the playing field between the Sherman and the Panther? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy these deep dives into the forgotten stories of military history, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Every week, we bring you verified, fascinating tales of combat innovations that change the course of war. Ring that notification bell so you never miss an episode. Because sometimes the greatest victories don't come from following the rules, but from having the